Pastor Jamal Bryant, one of the most recognizable names in modern ministry, has just dropped a revelation that nobody saw coming. Known for his fiery sermons, bold leadership, and unshakable confidence, Bryant has now stepped into the spotlight for a very different reason: a raw, personal confession that has left both his congregation and the public in disbelief. What he revealed about his private life has sent shockwaves through the faith community, sparking debates, dividing opinions, and forcing many to ask a difficult question: can a spiritual leader still lead after admitting something this personal? Stay tuned, because the truth behind this confession is deeper, more emotional, and more transformative than anyone imagined. For years, Pastor Jamal Bryant stood as a symbol of charisma, intellect, and fearless leadership in the modern church world. A man who could command a stage with his voice alone, Bryant wasn't just a preacher, he was a movement. From his early days leading Empowerment Temple in Baltimore to taking the pulpit at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, his name carried weight, power, and influence. His messages mixed faith with social awareness, challenging believers to face real-world issues without losing sight of spiritual purpose. To his congregation and millions watching online, Bryant seemed unstoppable, the kind of leader who could weather any storm and still deliver a sermon that moved hearts. His confidence was magnetic, his energy infectious, and his ability to connect with people unmatched. Many saw him as proof that modern faith could still be bold, relevant, and unapologetically real. But behind that powerful image was a man living under relentless pressure. The bigger his platform grew, the heavier the expectations became. Every sermon, every post, every appearance was watched, analyzed, and judged by thousands. To the public, Jamal Bryant was the picture of strength. But to those closest to him, that image was starting to show cracks. Friends began noticing subtle shifts. Moments of silence where once there was certainty, signs of exhaustion beneath the polished smile, and private conversations that hinted at inner conflict. While the world saw a leader filled with conviction, behind closed doors, Bryant was battling the weight of leadership, personal loss, and the haunting question of whether he could keep up the image he had built. This tension between public strength and private struggle would eventually push him to a breaking point, one that no one could have predicted. Because what came next would not only redefine his ministry, but change how millions viewed him forever. But as powerful as his public persona was, the truth about what he was facing privately would expose a far more complicated side of the man behind the pulpit's bright lights, and the thunderous applause of Sunday mornings. Pastor Jamal Bryant was living a far quieter battle, one few could see, and even fewer could understand. For years, he had carried the weight of being the example. Every word he spoke, every move he made, was held to an almost impossible standard. To the world, he was the man who seemed to have everything under control: faith, success, charisma, and influence. But inside, the reality was far more complex. Insiders close to Bryant describe a man wrestling with two worlds, the one he presented to the public and the one he lived in private. The demands of pastoring a megachurch, managing media appearances, and shouldering the expectations of tens of thousands of followers began to take a toll. The constant pressure to appear strong left little room for vulnerability and even less for error. And slowly, that pressure started to bleed into his personal life. Sources say that in quieter moments, away from cameras, microphones, and stages, Bryant often appeared reflective, even weary. There were late nights filled with soul-searching, questions about purpose, and conversations with close advisors that hinted at deep emotional exhaustion. Maintaining a flawless image in a world that demands perfection from its spiritual leaders can be crushing, and for Bryant, that weight grew heavier with each passing year. Friends noticed the signs, the pauses in his once fiery tone, the heavy sighs between sermons, and the growing sense that something deeper was stirring within him. Some describe a man struggling to reconcile his humanity with his responsibility. He had built a reputation as a fearless truth-teller, yet the hardest truth he faced was his own, that he was not immune to the same struggles, temptations, and conflicts he so often helped others confront. And while those around him offered support, Bryant reportedly grew more withdrawn, often reflecting on how faith leaders are celebrated for their strength, but rarely given space to be honest about their pain. It was this inner tension between authenticity and image that quietly began shaping what would become one of the most pivotal moments in his career. Because as the emotional strain deepened, Bryant realized something life-changing. Silence was no longer an option. The more he tried to suppress what he was feeling, the more it began to surface in ways he could no longer ignore. And that's when everything started to shift, when private reflection turned into public reckoning, and Pastor Jamal Bryant made a decision that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. The moment that would change everything didn't come overnight. According to those close to Pastor Jamal Bryant, it was the result of weeks, maybe even months, of emotional buildup and sleepless reflection. He had reached a point where the weight of his silence was heavier than the risk of speaking out. For years, Bryant had built his ministry on the foundation of truth and boldness, preaching about redemption, forgiveness, and the courage to face one's flaws. But now, those same words were being tested in his own life. Sources suggest that before stepping forward with his confession, Bryant spent long nights in prayer and consultation with trusted advisors. He understood the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, that this was not just a statement but a seismic shift that could alter the course of his ministry forever. The decision wasn't made out of impulse or emotion. It was calculated, deliberate, and deeply spiritual. When he finally took the pulpit that morning, the atmosphere was different. Eyewitnesses say you could sense something in the air, a stillness, a quiet tension before the storm. He began not with his usual fire, but with a voice that was calm, heavy, and honest. He spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the quiet pain of trying to live up to impossible expectations. And then, with the congregation hanging on every word, he revealed what few could have imagined. Bryant confessed that he had fallen short of his own spiritual standards. That beneath the polished sermons and confident exterior, he had been struggling with personal choices that weighed on his conscience. Though he did not go into every detail publicly, insiders confirm that his words were rooted in honesty, addressing past mistakes involving relationships, personal boundaries, and the consequences of pride. He admitted that his desire to appear strong had often kept him from being real, and that the cost of that facade had finally become too great. The reaction inside the church was electric, a mix of shock, compassion, and disbelief. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads in silence. A few stared ahead, frozen, as if trying to process what they had just heard. Bryant didn't seek sympathy. He sought truth. His tone wasn't defensive or rehearsed. It was raw, humble, and deeply human. He told his congregation that he wasn't confessing to gain forgiveness from the crowd, but to reclaim his integrity before God. "I've learned," he reportedly said, "that you can't lead people toward freedom while you're still bound by fear." That line struck a chord, echoing through the sanctuary like a release of collective tension. Observers later described it as one of the most vulnerable moments ever seen in a modern megachurch. For someone of Bryant's stature, a man often associated with power, eloquence, and confidence, to publicly strip away the armor was both shocking and inspiring. But what made it even more surprising was the timing. Bryant's confession came just as rumors and online chatter had started to circulate again about his personal life. Rather than let speculation grow, he chose to face it head-on. It was a move that could either redeem him or ruin him, and he knew it. Yet, instead of hiding, he stood before thousands and said what most leaders never would: "I'm human." And while that single admission shook his followers to the core, what came next? The public reaction, the online storm, and the cultural ripple effect would take the story to an entirely new level. Within hours of the confession, the story exploded. Clips from Pastor Jamal Bryant's emotional message spread across social media like wildfire. Twitter threads dissected every word. Instagram filled with clips of church members in tears, and YouTube reaction videos began piling up. For many, this was the first time they had ever seen a megachurch pastor openly confront his own flaws. The reactions were polarizing. Supporters praised Bryant's courage, calling it a turning point in church culture. "Finally, a leader who's not afraid to be real," one viral post read. Others saw it differently, accusing him of using transparency as a strategic move to rebuild his image after years of scrutiny. The debate quickly became about more than Jamal Bryant himself. It became a mirror for society's conflicting expectations of faith leaders. Should pastors be flawless symbols of righteousness, or can they be human beings who stumble and grow? Inside his church, emotions ran deep. Eyewitnesses described a sense of unity that followed the initial shock. Some members said they respected him more for telling the truth than for pretending to be perfect. Others admitted they struggled to reconcile the man they admired with the confession they had just heard. But one thing was certain: no one left unchanged. What could have been a moment of scandal instead sparked an unexpected wave of empathy. Meanwhile, mainstream media outlets jumped on the story. Commentators debated the future of his ministry, while faith-based networks hosted panels on accountability and leadership. The confession made national headlines, not as gossip, but as a conversation about honesty and redemption. Even critics acknowledged that Bryant had shifted the tone of religious transparency. As one journalist put it, he turned confession into conversation, and conversation into culture. But the most surprising part wasn't the public reaction. It was what began happening quietly behind the scenes. In the days that followed, reports began surfacing that Bryant's vulnerability had inspired other leaders to confront their own truths. Pastors across the country reportedly reached out privately, expressing gratitude for his courage. Some even held special gatherings in their own churches to address personal and collective struggles, something rarely seen in ministries where image often outweighs authenticity. What had started as a single confession had turned into a ripple effect, a quiet revolution of transparency within faith spaces. The message was clear: perfection is not the standard, honesty is. Bryant's openness had cracked a door that many others had kept tightly shut. Religious commentators noted that his decision marked a generational shift. Younger churchgoers, especially those raised in the age of social media, praised his honesty. They saw it as a reflection of real faith, not spotless performance. "People don't need pastors who look perfect," one viral TikTok comment read. "They need pastors who are honest about their scars." Even secular audiences found something compelling in his story. Influencers, podcasters, and self-help speakers began citing Bryant's confession as an example of emotional intelligence and public accountability. It wasn't just a church moment anymore. It had become a cultural conversation about leadership, truth, and humanity. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some critics argued that transparency alone doesn't erase consequences. They questioned whether Bryant's confession would be followed by real change or simply fade with time. Others speculated that more revelations might still come, hinting that his statement could be the beginning of a longer story, and they weren't entirely wrong, because Jamal Bryant himself hinted the same thing. In the weeks after the confession, those close to Bryant noticed something different about him. The tension that once seemed to hang over his shoulders appeared to ease. He seemed calmer, more grounded, as though speaking his truth had freed him from a silent prison. In interviews, he clarified that his goal was never to control the narrative, but to reclaim his peace. "You can't lead people into freedom," he said, "if you're living behind chains of fear." His sermons began to change. Gone were the perfectly polished phrases and controlled rhetoric. Instead, he spoke with raw emotion, about failure, forgiveness, and the fragile beauty of redemption. Church members said the messages felt deeper, more personal, and more real than ever before. Attendance didn't drop, and it rose. People who had stopped attending church began returning, drawn by the honesty that now defined his ministry. Bryant also began engaging more directly with issues of mental health among faith leaders. He admitted that the emotional isolation of leadership often leads to internal collapse. In doing so, he reframed the narrative from scandal to solution. Instead of running from the past, he began using it to empower others to confront their own hidden battles. His confession had indeed changed him, but perhaps even more profoundly, it had changed the people around him. Many of his members shared that his vulnerability helped them address their own struggles with shame, addiction, and forgiveness. "If my pastor can admit his truth," one congregant said, "then maybe I can stop hiding mine." Still, the journey ahead remains uncertain. Bryant continues to face scrutiny from critics who question his sincerity. But to those who know him, this new chapter isn't about reputation, it's about redemption. His story has become a living example that leadership doesn't mean perfection. It means honesty, growth, and resilience. And in a world obsessed with appearances, Jamal Bryant's confession stands as a reminder that the strongest thing a leader can do is tell the truth, even when it costs them everything. Pastor Jamal Bryant's confession wasn't just a shocking moment in church culture, it was a human one. It forced the public to confront the truth that even the most celebrated figures struggle behind closed doors. His willingness to admit failure reshaped how millions view leadership, not as a symbol of flawlessness, but as a journey through imperfection. He didn't just reveal a personal truth, he started a movement built on honesty. Whether you agree with his choices or question his motives, one thing is undeniable. His courage to stand in vulnerability changed the conversation about faith forever. And maybe that's the lasting message here, that grace isn't found in pretending to be perfect, but in having the strength to say, "I'm still learning," because sometimes